Okay, we're live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wikimedia Research Showcase for January 2022, the first one in the new year. My name is Martin Gerlach. I'm a research scientist here at the Wikimedia Foundation, and I'll be the host for this showcase. This showcase will focus on research beyond English Wikipedia. Why? Often research papers on Wikipedia implicitly mean that only the English Wikipedia is considered. In fact, one of the most common questions we receive in the Q&As, in the discussions in this showcase is how presented results generalize beyond a single, mostly the English Wikipedia. In addition, as a movement, we are committed to knowledge equity, and thus our aim is to support diverse community, and that excludes the many different language versions of Wikipedia. Therefore, the idea here is to highlight specifically studies that are trying to understand Wikipedia communities beyond English Wikipedia. And for this, I'm very excited and very glad to introduce today's speakers. I already want to thank them that they are taking the time to present their research here with us. First, we have Taryn Bipat. She's now at Microsoft, but the work she's presenting is from her time at University of Washington, and she will talk about comparing language communities. In the second half, we will have Jacob Thibault-Speaker, an assistant professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he will talk about understanding Wikipedia practices through Hindi, Urdu, and English takes on an evolving regional conflict. At the end of each talk, we have time for Q&A. So if you have questions for the speakers about their work, please put them in the chat or on IRC. My colleague Emily will monitor those channels and relay them here during the Q&A to the speakers. And before I hand it off and we actually start, I want to make a quick round of announcements. The first one is especially related to the discussion and the Q&A that for this event, the Wikimedia Foundation friendly space policy applies to ensure a harassment-free experience for every participant. I hope Emily can share a link in the chat. And my second announcement is related to the Wiki Workshop. The 9th annual Wiki Workshop is coming up. This is our largest research event of the year. Will take place virtually on April 25 as part of the Web Conference 2022. If you conduct research on the Wikimedia project, we encourage you to submit your ongoing or completed works. Submission deadlines are February 3 if you want your paper to appear in the proceedings, or otherwise it is March 10. And I hope Emily can share a link to Wiki Workshop too. And with this, without further ado, I want to pass it on to Taryn.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. Can everyone see my screen? Perfect. So I'm Taryn. I'm excited to share some of my dissertation research with all of you. This work is centered around understanding how editors collaborate on the English, French, and Spanish editions of Wikipedia. To start off, I'm going to start off by just telling you a story about Alexander. He's an editor in the French Wikipedia, and he also participates in both English and German. He translated content from an English article, transfers it to a French article. However, someone immediately reverts his changes. So Alex goes over to that talk page to find out what happens. The second editor comes over, explains to him that that content wasn't properly sourced, gives him some evidence to why he needs to fix it. And then Alexander finally understands what he did wrong and goes back to that article and fixes his issue. So Alexander's story is just a small part of a larger problem about understanding various language communities. Wikipedia is made up of over 300 different active language editions. So as Alexander switches between edition, he needs to better understand the content and policies unique to each edition. So because of all these intricacies and different contexts across 300 plus language editions, it's necessary to understand the behaviors in each one of these language editions. Additionally, in my field of computer-supported collaborative work, most of the research is around English Wikipedia. However, taking this Anglocentric perspective is at odds with all of the research that we do with other forms of work. It's awesome to be here today as part of a panel where we actually are seeing some expansion of this multilingual research. So to better understand this space, I dove into some Wikipedia literature, and I won't go into too much depth, but there were 3 spaces that were very relevant. First, the work around collaboration, as it's very important for the development of articles, then also policy and guidelines, as they help collaboration by resolving conflict and clarifying principles, and also policy and guidelines is something that exists across every language edition. And then also there is some multilingual research that focuses on how editors switch between languages, understanding the cultural diversity of content, and understanding how things like the neutrality policy arises across language editions. But as I was diving into this research, I found 3 research gaps that are relevant to my work that I felt like I could help fill. First, most of it's in English, so now I'm focusing on English, French, and Spanish. Secondly, a lot of this research is quantitative. Think about doing it across multiple language editions. It's much easier to get numbers from each platform, but I focus on qualitatively trying to understand each of these language editions. And then additionally, lastly, a lot of the research is influenced by the inherent culture of the editor. And I want to focus more on the culture that's produced by this online platform, by Wikipedia. So in this last research gap, it's important that I make this distinction between the inherent culture of an editor and the culture that we might see on Wikipedia talk pages. Because on Wikipedia, there's this dichotomy of how users present themselves online. They can either present themselves based on their inherent culture, their geographical location, or the way they choose to present themselves can be any other way they choose. So this is especially true because, for example, think of Juan, an example Spanish edition editor. He could possibly be from anywhere in the world, not only a Spanish-speaking country. So as a researcher, it's not fair for me to make assumptions about who Juan actually is. So diving into the research, what did I do? I focused a lot of my time on understanding article talk pages, how conversations were happening, and then also the edit history. So thinking about how articles are being revised and all their revisions. And then additionally, there's some contextual things that are important to note because these might be reasons for why we might see different collaboration models. So for the first thing is there are separate articles for the same topic, or the topic may just not exist at all. And one reason for this might be some topics are just not of universal importance. So here I have the structure of the Jay Inslee article. He is the governor of the state of Washington. In French and Spanish and English, we can show that they're all different lengths. They have different amount of contents. They might have unique timelines and maturity levels. Additionally, each article has its own unique talk page. And this is the site that I'm most interested in because it shows here. So for the Jay Inslee article, there's no conversations in French, and in English, there's so many conversations, suggesting that there's different ways of collaborating. So that's where my research comes into place, is thinking about how we can better understand collaboration in each of these editions. So the overall process was very iterative. As I learned new information from each study, the process changed. But overall, it ended up being 2 parts. Part A aims to explore how prior research in English translates to the French and Spanish editions. This is study 1 and 2. And then study 3 expands on the findings from part A and attempts to further detail what collaboration models look like in English, Spanish, and French. So with 3 different studies in 3 different languages, I ended up with 9 sets of data. So I had to find a way to analyze and weave all of that data into a cohesive story. So this is why it's also extremely difficult to present all this work in under 20 minutes today. So now let's get to it. In the first study, I took a collaboration model that already existed that described editor behaviors in the English Wikipedia from back in 2007. This paper by Viégas and al. Showed a behavioral model that essentially said that there was this 1-to-2 article to talk page edit ratio. What that means is that an editor would go to the talk page, say they were going to make an edit, then they'd go back to the article, actually make the edit, and then come back to the talk page and say, I've completed those changes. So that's 2 posts on the talk page and 1 edit article. When we took this quantitative model, we found that in 2018, when this research was done, that did not exist anymore. It was about 3-to-1 in English, and in French and Spanish, it was 16-to-1 and 8-to-1. And so it might not have even ever held in these other language editions. But that made us really interested in exploring what type of behaviors were actually happening on talk pages. And Viégas and al., when they presented that model, they had 11 different posting behaviors to classify the type of talk page post. And the biggest difference in English that I saw when I did this research is that the requests and suggestions for editing had decreased. And there was now a lot of other posts that actually did not fit that posting dimensions for Viégas and al. So we actually see that in English from 2007 to 2018, the platform itself and how people behave has evolved. So this suggests that editors are still using talk pages to collaborate, but also editors are spending more time, more text discussing the topic of an article rather than explicitly discussing the edits they're going to make to an article. And similarly, in French and Spanish, editors were interacting without actually doing explicit work to improve an article. We delve deeper into that other to kind of understand what some of these new behaviors are. And just some examples, there was more FYI for English and French was over 40%. And essentially there's greater amount of discussion around just a target article. And then also in Spanish and English, there was a significant amount of external sources. This sticks closest to traditional talk page policies and using external sources satisfy Wikipedia's verifiability policy. Additionally, in French and Spanish, there's opinion posts, and these were the second most common contribution. And here's an example from French where an editor has their own opinions about how to use templates and manage an article. However, this editor is not actually making any requests or suggests specifically to edit the article. It's just one example of new behaviors that were not mentioned in that original model. So the difference may be attributed also to some stylized distinctions I saw when I spent so much time reading through talk pages. So I saw some interesting things across the languages. So in French, they have these technical enhancements, those little blue boxes that manifest as like to outline the thread. While in English and Spanish, these blue boxes don't actually exist. They just have indentation. So this might be a possible reason why some new social processes exist in French or Spanish or English. So now moving on to the second study, I again took some findings that existed in English to another collaboration model and tried to understand how that exists in English, French, and Spanish. This model was used to understand the intersection of policy and debates on Wikipedia. It was by Kriplean and al., also done in 2007, and they created this model that identified these things they called power plays as language-based interactions in which editors gain control over an article in order to modify content in their preferred ways. So while policies were cited in talk pages to help create a consensus, there's debates around which policy is applicable, whether a policy is appropriate, and how that policy should be used to address a specific issue. So I took their model, and again, I tried to see what it looked like in 2019 in these 3 different language editions. I won't delve too deep into the findings, but I started off by looking at the frequency of the power plays. And just looking at the similarities to start off with across each language, there were not new power plays, and there were so many posts that had no power plays. We did code the entirety of the talk page. So as shown in study 1, there are a lot of talk page behaviors that do not revolve around actual debates around even editing the article. There are also some very provocative smaller differences that show us that each edition used the same power plays differently. So for example, practice on other pages were highest in French. One interesting example shows how French and Spanish was different because they elicited a language process that we might not find in English. So here's an example of a conversation that shows the complexities of translation. One editor does not like the fact that the person the article describes has so many first names. The second person uses practice on other pages, a power play, to try to clear up this problem. However, he notes that the French page is probably a translation and why part of this problem exists. So what we see here from these two studies is that there's power play mechanisms, policy mechanisms, and interpersonal communication mechanisms that all play a role in these language additions, but how they show up is different across the language additions. So it's time to start to synthesize and put all of this together and expand on those two findings. So my last study was actually getting to speak with Wikipedia editors. So I had English, French, and Spanish editors. They all had relatively a lot of experience on Wikipedia and a lot of edits. And in English and Spanish, I even got to speak to some administrators. Essentially, what I learned is that there are similar ways of doing things across languages. And this is reflective of study 1 and study 2. The similarity is not surprising, as many of these editors have been on Wikipedia for a long time and are guided by a structure that is common across language platforms like the 5 pillars of Wikipedia. But the biggest difference is the varied ways editors consider how consensus is driven, as shown in this table. It's, however, important to note that these consensus driving factors, they do exist in each language edition, but these are the ones that are most prominent in that language edition. So for English, many editors felt like if they had more experience, their knowledge was so important and helped guide debates. For French, it was less about authority and more about sources, the clarity of the argument. So the most clear argument would win a debate in French. And then in Spanish, administrators helped guide the editors. For most of the Spanish editors I talked to, they saw administrators as very symbolic. So I tried to dive in deeper to find out why this might be so important in Spanish. And there's only 68 administrators when I did this research, so relatively few in Spanish. But one of the reasons that this might exist is because in Spanish, there is no arbitration committee. So that responsibility ends up on the shoulders of the Spanish edition administrators. And so that's why they're seen as more powerful or symbolic on that edition. So now my job was to take all of these findings about behaviors, power play mechanisms, consensus driving factors, and put them together into a collaboration model. But honestly, the biggest difficulty is taking 9 different studies and trying to find a way to present a collaboration model. So the data shown in these studies are just the tip of the iceberg. I use narrative and data to tell a story that can provide insights in a way that's easily understood, but also a way that we can empathize with our editors. And earlier I showed you guys Alex's story. This is a narrative from French built from the data from these 3 studies. So for the sake of time today, I'm only going to share one more, and this is from the Spanish edition. So here, Pablo is an administrator. For Pablo, talk pages are a place for editors to collaborate, but also be respectful and civil with each other. Someone tags Pablo in a talk page where they're having a debate. So he tries to head over to help out. They're fighting over gendered nouns in the talk page. Pablo shows them how the situation was handled on another page and the solution found by other editors. And ultimately, that was how they resolved the problem. All of that story or narrative comes from the data from my study. So we found in study 1, Spanish editors were using talk pages as a place to make requests and suggestions for editing. Study 3, we saw that it's important that conversations are polite and constructive. Study 2 showed us that Spanish editors use prior consensus, and even study 3 that administrators are so symbolic and powerful. So this is a combination of the findings from all 3 studies, but particularly begin to demonstrate a relationship between the synthesis of study 1 and 2. So for example, editors were debating about gendered nouns in Spanish. There was a lot of opinions being thrown around. In the situation with editors, there were many editors sharing their own opinion, which led to a power of interpretation power play, as editors from one subcommunity wanted to believe their opinions had greater authority over the beliefs of others. And then finally, Pablo, an administrator, helped resolve that conflict. So to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about my overall contributions. First, this is just a plain empirical understanding of how collaboration models might exist in 3 different languages. So by looking at these results from a 3,000-foot view, I observed strong similarities in the collaborative practices related to article content discussions in Spanish, English and French. And it's not that surprising as the technological foundations of the platform are English language and US based. In direct contrast, Wikipedia was created with the intention of becoming a global platform, not only a US English based perspective. So thus, while content might be different, there are a lot of very similar behaviors influenced by the development and foundations of Wikipedia. So in other words, the way editors express themselves and coordinate their actions online is as nuanced and productive as the peer production platform actually allows. Additionally, it's possible to delineate these like small provocative differences, and many of these differences between these languages are based on the evidence that French and Spanish editors were not speaking English, the language the platform was initially created in. In the case of editor behavior, language processes such as translation impact the conversation that editors have and the debates that might happen. There are also some thought-provoking differences that are harder to explain. So for example, things like the stylized difference in the French platform. It kind of shows that there is a possibility that these different language editions have their own mannerism, structure, and hierarchy to work with. So one of the other things that was really difficult to navigate around when doing this work is the word culture. Ultimately, the similarity and differences found in these three studies are part of the culture specific to Wikipedia talk pages. In this study, I specifically acknowledge that Wikipedia talk page culture is partially composed of the interactions editors have with each other. A culture manifests on Wikipedia starting from the technical foundations of the platform that were initially developed in 2001 and the continuous development of the platform created by editors who help shape the way other users should behave. My second contribution is also replication. So I know Martin at the introduction talked about how does some of this research translate to other language editions, the number one question being asked at these panels. And exactly that's what I did with the first two studies, is thinking about how two very influential models now exist in English, French, and Spanish. And so with replicability, there came a couple of things. We saw the evolution of Wikipedia, the English one, and we also started to see how it exists in other languages. Furthermore, I showed how it could be done qualitatively. So one of the things with qualitative research is making it as consistent as possible. And then lastly, Wikipedia supports its own cultural identity. So through a replication study, I was able to use that prior data and methodology to be able to understand the platform without making assumptions about the inherent culture of editors. And then my last contribution is a methodological contribution. I can only hope that more people will start to do studies like this. So I give the tools and the resources on how to do qualitative multi-site research on Wikipedia, also highlighting some of the challenges like presenting 9 studies in 20 minutes, or matching the demographics of different populations, or understanding how we make things consistent when policies and guidelines differ across these different editions. Of course, with research like this comes limitations. And the first limitation is that most of the data analysis and presentation of findings was conducted by one person. So while I'm a native speaker of English, I was only taught French and Spanish in school and through my community. So my knowledge of each individual language does not meet the threshold of expertise as a native speaker would have. And I try to mitigate this impact by having native French and Spanish speakers gather and analyze the data. And we had a weekly conversation to reconcile those findings. Additionally, and probably the biggest limitation of it all, is that I take a very Western Romance level centric perspective of Wikipedia. And so what that means is that we essentially need to do more work. And I actually wrapped up a study that's published in the CSCW conference where I had 2 researchers who are native speakers of Farsi and Chinese do the similar research. And we begin to see how policy and power mechanisms are driven by unique contextual consideration. Chinese and Farsi have unique maturity timelines, different textual and linguistic issues. Both languages are written in non-Latin scripts and have language structures that are not the same as many Western languages. So what does this all mean? Wikipedia is just one example of a peer production community. And as designers and researchers, it's really important for us to now think about how we can help facilitate this collaboration across language editions of any platform, especially for platforms that are starting off as very US-based or English-centric. And of course, before I wrap up, I have to thank the committee village of people that helped me through the last 5 years to get this work done at the University of Washington Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Taryn, for for this talk, for this very excellent presentation. Lots of stuff to unpack here, I think. I want to invite everyone in the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will relay them to Taryn and we discuss. Until then, we can start off here in the room if anyone wants to start with a question. Maybe you can stop sharing the screen if you want, then we can see the speakers better. I think. Perfect. If no one starts, then I will start.
Diego had a question, but
Diego, then Diego, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. No, thank you very much for the presentation. It's super interesting. It's funny because just yesterday I was looking into these ratios of between articles like content pages, namespace 0 and namespace 1, and I was looking for this just for 1 month, and the numbers that I got are a bit different. And I understand that the reference that you were using there, I saw that was from 2007. So maybe the evolution of that, and you mentioned that this is changing, but the ratios now I think are more in the 1 to 10 than 1 to 3 or 1 to 4, and it varies a lot as you showed there. It's very different depending on the size and the history, like in the maturity, I would say, of the project. So do you have a sense of, or you have any reflection on what you think could be the ideal, or what means that this is different, that maybe if we study the historical trend on this, maybe when Wikipedia started, people doesn't know how to use talk pages, or what will be the sweet point there? I imagine that there's no one unique answer for that, but I would like to know your reflection around that.
So just based on talking to editors, right, what I learned is that over time their uses of Wikipedia changed, right? So a lot of people started Wikipedia because maybe they were watching a movie or something and they got to Wikipedia article and found something wrong and wanted to edit it, right? So they ended up spending a lot of time actually like writing articles, editing articles, and then 10 years later they've spent on Wikipedia. That now they kind of just go around cleaning things up or resolving bigger issues, right? So like that's one of the things that might influence that. So they spend a lot more time debating these higher level issues now than they did back in the day when they spent more time, like, you know, making smaller edits or things. So like that's one of the reasons that things might happen like that. Also, I think just in general, Wikipedia had a platform has evolved on how people see it and use it. So a lot of people, like, I mean, the readership of Wikipedia is much bigger than the editorship of Wikipedia. So a lot of people are reading the article and talking about the topic itself. So for example, they want to talk about how hot the sun is rather than editing that number on the Wikipedia article, right? So and that's another reason that I could see those numbers having such a dramatic change from 2007 to 2018.
Thank you very much.
Miriam, you had a question.
Yeah, I think I can go next. Thank you, Taryn, so much for this research. It's really amazing presentation. Thank you so much. As you said, doing multilingual research is extremely important, especially for a project that spans over 300 language editions. And one of the reasons why this is not done more often, like that you have done, is because of the barriers that you've been talking about. So I was wondering if you could share some learnings with this community about how to do multilingual research even as a non-native speaker, like where it's needed to, where, for example, automatic translation tools can help, or where it is needed to involve local communities. What is also the role of culture, for example? I'm thinking it's not only about language. I might speak 2 languages, but I don't know enough about one culture. So if you have suggestions, I think everybody would be very happy to. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is something that I just had to iterate on as I started this work. So I started study one by partially translating some of it myself and then trying to read through the comments. And I figured that didn't work because I couldn't understand everything, even through just like a simple translation. So here is my processes on how this was able to be done. And it literally takes a village to do research like this. So at the University of Washington, I ran, I would say, like 9 or 10 research groups, and these each had about 6 to 8 people in it. So we continuously were doing this research with native speakers and having them code a subset so that we can then discuss and make sure we're all on the same page. So like for qualitative research, we all think about doing like inter-rater reliability coding and stuff like that. With Wikipedia, we don't have a sample big enough to be able to do that on some of these languages. French and Spanish doesn't have that many conversations. So in the end, what worked was doing consensus coding between native speakers. So every week they code a little bit, come in, we discuss it, we do round robins to make sure that we're all on the same page. And that's really the best way of mitigating some of this. The other thing is just finding a way to take all of that data and present it in a way. And I think the only way to really do that is like the narrative perspective of like illustrating what the data looks like rather than writing it out in full paragraphs, because these papers can end up being like 30 pages of quotes and data from 3 different qualitative studies. So
very interesting. I hear there is questions from YouTube. Emily, would you relay them?
Yep. So here's our first question from YouTube. Earlier on, I believe you mentioned how design elements of talk pages may be affecting the types and/or nature of talk page discussions. So first, can you clarify to make sure that that point was understood correctly? And then they're wondering if there are any additional specific examples that you can discuss, or if you can further clarify the example that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So this is me making connections across some of the studies. So in the first study, one of the things that I brought up in this presentation was the stylistic differences on the French page versus on English and Spanish with the threaded boxes. And then going on to the third study where we actually talked to editors, one of the things that they really asked for and was one of the consensus driving factors was clarity and concise arguments, right? So connecting back to how maybe a threaded, clean argument might actually play a role in how debates happen. So that's both a technical process and a social process kind of influencing each other. And another example of this, for example, is like in English, there's now many more template boxes, little template boxes across talk pages. So there's different ways of thinking about things because there's so many templates now rather than having discussions about how to do something. And all of this kind of, these technical changes are essentially manifesting these new types of social processes.
Okay, thanks. We have one more question from YouTube. And that is, how much of the observed between language differences do you ascribe to organizational mechanics? So for example, would enlarging the Spanish admin pool be enough to change talk page interaction patterns?
That's a really good question. And something I have thought about, but I guess the big differences that I really point at here are due to speaking a different language that's not English. So I don't know if actually, a bigger organized group would make a difference there because they would still be speaking these different languages that it's not based on. So I think there's a little bit of like how the platform was designed based on an English US perspective. And that's why some of these new behaviors are being developed or shown in the talk pages.
Great. Last call here for last question in the room. Please unmute yourself if you think, otherwise I think we can wrap up the discussion here and revisit after Jacob's talk. Thank you so much, Taryn, for now, for this great presentation. And we will switch to Jacob. Please go ahead. And if you have questions for Jacob, please put them in the chat for the Q&A afterwards.
And folks, bear with me a second. My dual monitor setup seems to have fallen apart again. Okay, I think you all can see this now. There's a puppy on screen, right?
Yes, that looks good.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Jake. I want to start by just saying this is my puppy Luna. She's new in our household and doesn't sleep very well yet. So please bear with me a little bit. But I just, I figured I'd start off a little bit light here. Today, I want to talk to you about our paper called to present our work, Understanding Wikipedia Practices Through Hindi, Urdu, and English Takes on an Evolving Regional Conflict. This work was conducted by a really great team, including Molly Hickman, Viral Prasad, Harsh Kamalesh Sanghavi, myself, and Dr. Sangwan Lee. It's important to note here that I'm currently an assistant professor at the Information School at the University of Wisconsin, but this work was conducted while all authors were at Virginia Tech, either as students or postdocs or faculty. The other thing I'll say is slides, if you're interested and are watching out in the world, slides are available here at gowisconsin.edu/7zep7c. And then I've also provided preprint, a link to the preprint open access version of the paper. Or if you'd like to go to get a formal version, you can visit this at my website and make sure to look for the authorizer link. That's the sort of formal open access version of the work here. So we'll jump in. And I want to start with a little bit of a history lesson here. First and foremost, I want to focus on the history of the region of Jammu and Kashmir. From 1846 to 1952, and this is sort of starting at a point in time, there was obviously people living there and country level organizations and so forth prior to 1846. But from 1846 to 1852, this area was considered the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. At that point in time, this area was formally a part of the British East India Company and their sort of empire building across the world. And was ruled regionally. So it was not ruled by someone necessarily as a part of the British East India Company, but was ruled by a local regional Maharaja, right? Shifting more recently, right, in 1954, this area became the state of Jammu and Kashmir, largely under Indian rule, under the rule of the country of India. And while there were some sections of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir that were under Pakistani rule, and a little bit that was under ruled on the eastern side of the area that was ruled by China, most of this region became ruled by India at this point in time, which sort of culminated in these lines of control that you can see here in this visualization from the BBC, right? So a portion of this region was ruled under Pakistan, a portion of this region is ruled under India, and a small portion is ruled under China as well. Importantly, sort of both Pakistan and India claim the entirety of Jammu and Kashmir as part of their country, but each sort of controls administratively a certain point. And that existed up through relatively recently. And just to add another level of complexity here as well, most Kashmiri people who live in the region, when polled and so forth, would prefer independence from both India and Pakistan. But currently, that is not the case. So the state of Jammu and Kashmir, despite being sort of under Indian rule, was granted autonomy in 1954 under Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which means that basically all of the laws that India passed that would apply to the region of Jammu and Kashmir need to be approved by the local regional government for them to sort of fully apply. So it's part of a state, it's a state that's a part of India, but has some autonomy independent from the Indian government up through 2019. Basically, they need to, Jammu and Kashmir, the government of Jammu and Kashmir needs to agree to any of those laws prior to those laws taking effect. Now, in 1989, so to roll back a little bit, about 30 years or so, there was 1989 kicked off a sort of prolonged conflict in the region between Indian police and the separatists, or some separatists and secessionist groups who were advocating for secession from India. This became reinvigorated in 2008, and then unrest in 2016 and 2017 resulted in the death of 90 civilians with over 1,500 people wounded. And so this all culminates in February 2019 when an attack in the Pulwama area, there was an attack on Indian police, which killed 40 officers. And this attack was claimed by a militant group that was backed by the Pakistani government at the time. This attack in Pulwama sort of kicks off the set of events that I'm going to talk to you about here today. To some extent, this is the backdrop to the story, right? But in August 2019, the Indian government revokes Article 370 of the Indian Constitution and nullifies all of the provisions that grant autonomy to the region, right? So now the region is under Indian government rule. No, the region no longer has autonomy and no longer has sort of approval from laws coming down from the Indian government. And then further than that, another bill was introduced by the Indian Parliament in August 2019 that reorganizes the state into 2 union territories under India, right? So removes statehood to some extent, removes autonomy, and shifts the region under sort of direct rule of the Indian government. This is sort of the central event and controversy of our study, right? So to some extent, the reason this becomes the central controversy of our study, right, is that this kind of question and these kind of contentious events risk creating some strong tensions around neutral point of view, a substantial policy within Wikipedia, broadly stated, right? As many of you know, maintaining consensus around a neutral point of view is an important policy within Wikipedia. It's a pretty fundamental aspect of how the community runs. But these kinds of contentious issues or political controversies, if you want to frame them that way, risk creating tensions with this overall goal. There are 2 sort of particular risks to neutral point of view that come about from contentious or political controversies. The first is knowledge gaps, and the second is sort of the creation of potential adversarial narratives within the kinds of content that get posted and maintained within Wikipedia, right? First and foremost, knowledge gaps sort of in this case refer to the potential for different language editions of Wikipedia to present different and divergent kinds of information in the same kinds of articles, right? And this can occur because a reader might be monolingual or their language edition doesn't characterize events the same way as another language edition, right? But this can be further exacerbated too in polarized contexts, right? If someone is proximate to a contentious issue and a contentious event and is looking for information about it in their own language, they risk getting sort of a polarized or incomplete perspective on a given event because of, you know, what kinds of sources get cited, who's doing the creation, these kinds of topics, right? And then further, Some prior work has shown that these kind of knowledge gaps are able to be exploited by people trying to advocate for adversarial narratives or trying to spread propaganda online. To some extent, data voids are an opportunity, as described by Golubowski and Dana Boyd, who suggest that these kinds of voids in data can be exploited for the purposes of, for instance, manipulating search results or other kinds of things like that, right? And so the fundamental question of our work is, how do editors in Wikipedia cope with challenges in sustaining neutral point of view, right? And so this is sort of the driving question behind our work, right? And we focus this on the revocation of Article 370 in the Indian Constitution and the events related to that event and that point in time. Now, importantly, I just want to point something out here, right? Note the regional difference is across administration, right? Pakistan and India and a little bit of China. What this means is that there are a number of languages spoken in this region, right? And the three primary languages of this region are Urdu and Hindi and English, as you might have gathered from the title, right? So not only were we focusing on this contentious topic, but we also wanted to understand how this research question played out across three different languages, right? How does the question around maintaining neutral point of view interact with different language editions of the same set of topics, right? The same set of contentious political issues. Many of you are probably familiar with neutral point of view, but I'm going to give you just a quick overview and talk about how it relates to our study, right? In general, there are 9 guiding principles of neutral point of view, at least in the English Wikipedia, all of which are described pretty thoroughly on the policy page, right? But the gist here, right, is that articles must not take sides, but should explain the sides fairly and without editorial bias. This applies both to what you say and how you say it. That's the primary premise of the neutral point of view policy. But for our purposes, we're also focusing on 3 of the guidelines articulated in the neutral point of view policy that are sort of most actionable and salient to our work here, right? Due and undue weight, referring to the requirement that all articles treat relevant viewpoints in proportion to the prominence of each viewpoint in published reliable sources. Impartial tone, which aims to describe disputes but not engage in them, and words to watch, where editors are asked to eliminate expressions that are flattering, disparaging, vague, or cliched, or that endorse a particular point of view, right? You can see how these kinds of tones, these kinds of issues around neutral point of view might interact pretty directly with political, contentious political issues, right? And just to provide some context here, the specific set of pages in our analysis, we focused on 5 particular pages, or 5 particular topics more accurately, right? And these 5 topics all had pages for the same topic across all 3 language editions, except for the Urdu language, which does not have a page for the sort of topic or title insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir, right? The point being, though, that these threads carry through across different language editions, right? And so I want to pivot here from sort of introducing the topic and introducing what our study tries to do, and move towards a set of results, right? Overall, we took sort of a mixed methods approach, trying to look both quantitatively at how editors responded to these events, sort of temporally and in terms of what kinds of actions that people took, as well as how much overlap editors had across different language editions. But we also looked qualitatively both at the content of those pages themselves and conducted interviews with editors. For the sake of time, and I may cut some of this anyway for the sake of time, but I'm going to focus here today on our article and our content analysis, as well as some interview findings from editors. There's a lot more in the paper, but mostly I'm setting aside the quantitative stuff for today, but I'd encourage you all to go take a look at the paper if you want sort of a more holistic picture. But first, I want to talk through these sort of article or topic level comparisons that we made, and then move into digging into our interview findings a little bit. So just to put a point on it though, right? The specific set of pages in our analysis, we focused on these 5 particular topics. And for the purposes of the sort of content analysis approach, the way to think about this is thinking about each topic and across all language editions, and looking at sort of a comparison between the content of the page itself. And we see, in doing this content analysis, we see 2 primary sets of results. First is sort of discrepancies in information being presented across different language editions. And then also violations of sort of the impartial tone principle of neutral point of view, right? I'm not going to walk through these in a lot of detail, but I want to draw your attention to the bold sections here, right? And just to note here, right, A2 refers to an article or a topic, EN refers to English, HI refers to Hindi, and UR refers to Urdu, right? So we're looking at representations of the text itself from different articles in different languages. And importantly, what we see specifically is mischaracterizations of the number of people who were killed in the Central Reserve Police Force across different language editions, right? The English language edition says that the attack results in deaths of 40 Central Reserve Police Force personnel. The Hindi page says the Indian security personnel was attacked by Pakistani terrorists on Jammu-Srinagar National Highway, in which 45 security personnel lost their lives. Later in the Hindi article, right, we see Indian security personnel was attacked by militants in the Avantipora area of Jammu and Kashmir's Pulwama district, in which about 40 soldiers lost their lives. And then again in Urdu, as a result of the attack, the terrorist and 46 members of the Central Reserve Police Force were killed, right? 40 versus 45 versus 40 versus 46, right? Discrepancies in sort of just the facts of the matter as a side effect of or across these different language editions, right? Further than that, we see discrepancies in sort of inclusion of certain kinds of information, right? Within the English page, there is no reference to terrorists, right? Within the English page, the responsibility of the attack was claimed by a Pakistan-based Islamist militant group, names the attacker and says that the attacker was local to the Pulwama district, right? In the Hindi page, we see that a convoy of CRPF vehicles carrying Indian security personnel was attacked by Pakistani terrorists on the Jammu-Srinagar highway. And in the Urdu page, we see that the Pulwama attack was a terrorist attack on a convoy of Indian security forces, right? Note even the difference between Urdu and Hindi, suggesting that there was a terrorist attack, but it may or may not have been facilitated by Pakistani terrorists, right? And further than that, sort of leading into this other idea, we also see discrepancies in characterization of how the events occurred, right? Pakistan claimed that the captured men were Kashmiri, quote, freedom fighters, which is a claim that was contradicted by international media, according to the English page, right? According to the Hindi page, Kashmir dispute is going on between India and Pakistan since 1947 over the authority on Kashmir. For this, Pakistan has attacked thrice on India and all 3 times was severely defeated. And according to Urdu, the Kashmir issue is a dispute between Pakistan, India, and Kashmiri freedom fighters, no quotes here, over the ownership of occupied Kashmir, right? Characterization of the same set of events over time and representation of who was enacting this conflict, right? So I also want to, the other piece of this that I want to pull out here is violations of impartial tone, right? And I'm going to sort of speed up here a little bit and skip over some things just for the sake of time. But the other piece of this section that I want to emphasize here, right, is places in which the text of these articles themselves might violate an impartial tone guideline from the NPOV perspective, right? Note again here in bold, right? And I'm not going to read this as much, right? But we see phrases like necessity and phrases like mouth-shattering defeat and phrases like, why is Kashmir not happy? And then referring to Pakistan's tricks, right? We see phrases like separatists, terrorists, and masters who are having fun at their cost, at the cost of the people of Kashmir, right? And really, if you want power, then talk about occupying Kashmir, right? The point here being that most of the content in these articles frequently does not have a corresponding reference, A, but B, reads more as opinion, right? Subjective and potentially even aggressive, right? Things like tricks and mouth shattering are pretty clearly expressions, right? Rather than sort of reference verifiable information that is neutral. Now, some of these opinions can be milder as well. This doesn't all have to be mouth shattering, right? While Hindi editors see the conflict in Kashmir as a dispute between India and Pakistan only, Urdu editors' views on this conflict seem to involve another group, sort of consistently stating that there is a third group in the Kashmiri equation, right? So for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit and jump past our interview responses in particular, generally stated. But I want to draw your attention to one thing that does come out of our interviews. We interviewed 6 editors. And first, and what I want to draw your attention to is that one of our participants, so there's this context, right, around characterization and representation of these different topics in different language editions of Wikipedia, right? Some of which is more vitriolic, some of which is much more mild, right? But one of our participants also told us, recently a colleague of mine was doxxed by right-wing media outlets and an Indian police service officer, leading him to be outed and vanishing his account. It was quite a dangerous time to be editing that particular article in English, mind you, resulting in most Indian editors just stepping away, including me, from editing contentious topics. Eventually, the article was locked, the talk page was locked, that's very rare, to stop an influx of clearly POV editors who wanted to bias the article. The editor I was talking about was threatened and arrested by a public servant. Another colleague of mine had threats sent to his family, right? Alarmingly, sort of one of our participants is sharing this story that sort of raises the stakes for ensuring neutral point of view across different language editions and around particularly contentious topics, depending on someone's own political environment, right? So I want to shift towards thinking about some conclusions and high-level takeaways, and I'm going to be fast, I promise, right? While our results suggest that neutral point of view edits do happen, and targeted and malicious attacks towards a particular perspective do tend to occur, frequently those are caught by the community. But looking at the content analysis more concretely, there are still some sections of these articles that end up violating a neutral point of view perspective, which seems to be as a side effect of sort of how things are characterized or the tone, rather than lack of citation or pretty egregious propaganda kinds of campaigns. Now, I think the other thing that I want to elevate here, right, is thinking about sort of ways in which data voids and knowledge gaps and the risks that may come about. In general, what we see is that the possibility of these kinds of data gaps and the risks of data voids and the risks of sort of manipulation for Google and outside audiences could have occurred. In general, that doesn't seem to be true in our data, right? It seems that the likelihood of these sort of naturally occurring data voids is relatively low, that editors in small language editions, even in small language editions, are pretty responsive to things like bad faith editing. And our data does not seem to suggest that these kinds of adversarial edits stick around very long. However, the predominant form of neutral point of view kinds of content, or sort of violations of neutral point of view kinds of content in our studies, was in articles in Hindi and in Urdu that characterize the topic through a specific lens, giving different kinds of impression about the conflict itself. For instance, the Urdu articles referred to sort of the conflict being made up of 3 different groups: Pakistan and India and Kashmiri freedom fighters, whereas the English and Hindi articles do not describe Kashmiri activists as a part of this conflict. They either don't mention them at all, or they frame them as somewhat as either aligned with an Indian or a Pakistani side. And notably, this style of neutral point of view, or the style of violation of neutral point of view, is a violation of the due and undue weight guideline, which seems to be more prolific in our results than other models of violating a neutral point of view perspective. And then I'll just say that I want to end here quickly. The other major takeaway from our findings is that there seems to be a tension between the goal of growth for small language editions, and their capacity to maintain neutral point of view throughout that growth process. In Hindi and Urdu language editions in our study, probably as a side effect of smaller numbers of editors focused on production of content, while it might be the case that people are focusing on including content within Hindi or Urdu to grow the language edition overall, they may be missing important aspects of the article. And importantly, they might not even readily recognize that they are missing important aspects of an article without sort of a direct comparison to larger language editions. It's not to say that the English perspective is necessarily the gold standard, although it is a reference point for the editors in our study. And certainly the English language edition is much more mature and robust in terms of what gets characterized. So I am going to stop here for the sake of time. Thank you very much for your time and the extra 4 minutes on top of it. Do y'all have any questions?
Great, Jacob. Thank you so much for this very, very interesting talk. I want to remind everyone in the audience, if you would like to ask a question to Jacob or also related to the previous talk or to both, put them in the chat. We'll relay them here. In the meantime, I'll start here in the room. I know there are some questions. Just unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yep. Thanks, Jake, for the talk. I mean, very poignant issue and really interesting research. I think the first piece I wanted to ask about was around sources. So with neutral point of view, like one of the big determinants of whether content or a particular viewpoint is included is kind of the ability, verifiability, like ability to kind of cite it, and then whether that source is reliable. So I was wondering if in your analyses or interviews with editors, folks talked about kind of sources, and just curious, yeah, were they similar across the language editions? Were the different language editions pulling their own kind of local sources? Just anything around that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces of context here. First is that we recruited by focusing on editors who have a fair number of edits, right? So these are probably more permanent members of the community, first of all, right? And second of all, who probably understand, at least to some extent, the premises behind neutral point of view, right? And the goals of verification and these other kinds of issues. But what our editors report, right, is that they reference the English versions of these articles, both for content, for like the kinds of things that the article should be, and they're and participating in translation work frequently for these kinds of topics. But more concretely, they tend to rely on the sort of approved set of sources within English Wikipedia for neutral point of view. So they weren't running into substantially local sources necessarily, in part because they were sort of offloading the work to a larger community who has done some of the structuring around what sources are reliable, what sources can we trust, how much can we rely on, you know, these kinds of topics for these sorts of claims. And, you know, to some extent, those are connected, right? If you're thinking about primarily doing translation work, making sure that you're translating and relying on the same sources that a translation might have, or the source material for your translation, it seems somewhat reasonable that you might choose to do that. And certainly, I guess the other piece of this is we also saw that our editors talked a lot about trying to make sure that they were being conscientious of how do we know that a given source is reliable, or how do we know that a given claim needs a source or doesn't? So they did still revert things that were uncited, unsourced, right, in many ways. And I think they sort of ended up tending to be conservative towards relying on well understood sources from larger, more mature language editions.
Thank you. If I'm allowed a follow-up to that, you mentioned kind of the translation piece, and I'd be curious whether thinking about some, especially where you see like factual differences between the articles, did you get a sense of whether that was in part because you have kind of a rapidly changing situation and maybe initial content gets translated and then, you know, smaller community just doesn't have time necessarily for the maintenance, or just curious if you saw any kind of indications around that?
Yeah, that is our sense, is that essentially early translations might have been occurring, early news sources might have been stating incorrect things as the situation is changing, and that a non-trivial portion of these violations of neutral point of view, either because of omission or because of sort of inability to update frequently, that it is partially about scale of the community, and that it is partially about both scale of the community, but also an aim towards trying to grow language editions. The editors that we spoke to are interested in growth for the Hindi language edition or the Urdu language edition, and are primarily trying to build out content rather than doing maybe some of the more cleanup style work, and not necessarily coming back per se, right? That's one of the areas that we think automated tools, presuming one can sort of address the issues of training data in small language editions. Those are one of the places where we think automated tools could be potentially fruitful, right? Is trying to identify how up to date is this article, how much can we communicate, how can we contextualize how much you should trust what is here, based on trying to sort of support growth within small language editions, but also recognizing that there is potentially a tension between growth of a language edition overall and the capacity to maintain issues around neutral point of view or other kinds of policy kinds of expectations.
Thanks for that. Yeah, no, I think a really interesting piece. Open for others if they have questions. Well, then maybe I can ask something more, or make a point and ask something more broadly, and to Taryn, if you're still around too. So one of the things I liked about both of these pieces of work is that you're just dealing with 3 language communities and already seeing like a huge amount of difference and coming out of this. And especially because both of you are doing kind of this rich qualitative work, so you can really, I guess, see some of these nuanced differences. So I'm curious, one of as we think about like ways to make some of this multilingual research easier, just what sorts of, I guess, pieces were you maybe seeing on the qualitative side that would have been harder to kind of detect quantitatively, or spaces where kind of tooling around that, or would make it easier to do this research at scale?
I have an initial thought, and then Taryn, if you have suggestions, I'd encourage you to cut me off if you want. One of the things that the way that we address this, right, to some extent, I mean, some of the team members are native speakers of Hindi. Nobody on the team, as far as I understand, is a native speaker of Urdu. I certainly don't speak either of those languages, right? And so the way that we address this problem, especially on the content analysis side, was relying on native speakers from systems like Upwork, or other sort of available for hire translation work, to try to get into some of both the capacity to understand the language natively, and the capacity to get into and sort of characterize some of the idiomatic or sort of more offhanded, flippant kinds of translations that we were interested in studying in particular, right? Opinion is the kind of thing that isn't a clear translation always, and does require native speaking. And so we paid translators to do that work for us. Upwork is a mechanism that would allow that to occur, but presuming you have a reasonable coverage of people who can be translators who are native speakers. But I think that's an open question in some ways, right? We sort of figured out a strategy, but I'm not sure it generalizes fully.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. For the Farsi and Chinese work that we did, before we even started that work, we made sure we could find native speakers, because we knew when we ran into like non-Romance, non-Western languages, we would end up with the problem of we couldn't just use a translator anymore if necessary, especially to understand things like opinion. So before we even started that study, we made sure we could recruit enough coders from the University of Washington that speak Chinese and Farsi. And then they were a team that worked with a researcher that was also a native Chinese and Farsi speaker. So, and then I think going back to your question, you also asked, like, what things do we need to ask qualitatively versus quantitatively? And, in my whole 5 years of research, I did very little quantitative work. And that's because as I started, I did that little quantitative analysis of how many things were happening on a talk page versus on an article. And the numbers were so drastic, and I would have had to do that for so many articles. And I figured that I would also see such drastic numbers, but I didn't know why, right? And so that's the thing I continuously run into when you have one platform that has such a large content advantage over other platforms, that the numbers are so drastically different and you have no understanding why. So the qualitative piece just seemed necessary at the start of the research.
I think the scale question, I think the scale question is an important one here, especially from a quantitative perspective, right? We didn't report, we actually did report the total number of articles in each of our language editions, right? But for instance, there are 139,000 articles in Hindi and 154,000 articles in Urdu or so, right? Versus something like 6 million in English as of the time of doing this work, right? Scale here is hard, and quantitative analysis is hard, especially depending on what it is you're trying to study and how you're intending to sort of go about it, right? It's not clear from at least on first blush that anti-vandalism tools or the kinds of tools that could, for instance, help identify how reliable a given page can be from a reader's perspective. It's not clear that automated tools can operate on the scales that these small language editions exist at, or at least I think it's an open question. And I think there's a set of methods that may need to be developed about sparse data and how we can train models or other kinds of automated tools to support those sorts of things.
Yeah. And just to add to that, the other problem that we ran into doing multiple languages, you need to keep things as consistent as possible. But then, for example, in the second study, we needed to look for controversial pages, and in most languages, an easy controversial tag. When we got to Chinese, there wasn't a controversial tag. So we then needed to figure out if there was a tag that was close enough that we could then compare. And so there is many things like that where we needed to go back and reevaluate at every step to try to be as consistent as possible. And then, for example, I mentioned I got a lot of conversations that had no power play. And that's because we had to code the entire page to get enough content, because in French and Spanish, if you just look for those critical conversations, you would have nothing to code, right? So that just goes back to the sparsity of things, not having the same templates, not having the same policy and guidelines, all of the developmental things that might be different across the board.
I'm sorry I was shortly disconnected, so I did miss the cue about the question. Are there more questions in the room? I'll give it a few seconds. But if that's not the case, I think we're also at time, then we will wrap it up here. I want to thank both Jacob and Taryn for their really great talks here. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for this great research. Thanks for giving great presentations and for this great discussion, of which I unfortunately missed some of it, but I did catch up until the end. At the end, I want to thank everyone who tuned in or who will tune in later to watch this. Thanks for your questions and for the discussion about this. This was really insightful. I want to thank also people. Thank Emerald for the technical support here for the live stream. And with this, I want to mention the Wiki Workshop once more. If you want to submit your work around Wikimedia research, please submit there. The first deadline is in February 3. We invite you to submit your works there. And that's the last thing I will say before wishing you a good rest of your day, wherever you are, and see you next month for the next research showcase, hopefully. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.